Good morning, dear friends. Today it is Tuesday, the 29th of Tishrei, the 5th of October. We are studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Talmud Shabbas chapter 8, we're on Ayin Tes 79a. And today, with Hashem's help, we'll turn the page to 79b. We are still broadly in the discussion about the dimensions, the sizes of items that would make them not allowed to be carried on Shabbos, with the point that the smallest useful dimension, the smallest useful measure of an item is the amount of the item that ought to be carried on Shabbos. And so we've been exploring, we explored yesterday, and we'll finish up today, a discussion about leather. I just hit mute also. Again, if you'll please unmute yourself, but you're just hearing my voice. And please unmute yourself. Please don't shy away from questions and comments. As always, that's what makes this class or this discussion unique and insightful. So just to remind you, I falsely promised that we're going to be done with this discussion. We have 2 more segments to consider. So the question was like this: leather cannot be carried when it's useful. How much leather is useful? Well, the smallest item that the Mishnah or the Brisa could consider useful was a kameya case, a kameya holder. Kameyas are quite small, and a piece of leather can nicely cover it, contain it, and that would be the smallest kind of wallet, the smallest leather item that was considered useful, valuable, and therefore you couldn't carry it. The question became, what about leather that was not processed? Like, it's not leather, hide. And Rab Nachman says that hide too is at the very same dimension, the amount of hide that would become leather, that would become a pouch, a packet for an amulet. The Gemara Rava then challenges Rab Nachman and says, is it so that there's no difference between processed and unprocessed material? And then we went through a series of items. Well, initially we brought proof from one text that showed that for the purposes of wool, whether it's a finished product or not, we give it the same dimension. We then brought a series of challenges to Rav Nachman's assertion that it doesn't matter if the item is finished, it's ready or not. And in each case where we show that we do distinguish between the finished product and when it's in the process, the Gemara had to explain why those cases are not identical to leather. So just for example, we spoke about dyeing. So that when it comes to dyeing, you may have something. Once the dye is ready, you could dip in the smallest amount of material that has value because it would be a dugma, an example, a sample. But you're not going to engage the process unless you have a larger piece of material. So over there, we differentiate between the finished product once you're already doing it and what would have to trigger you into the process. We said leather, there's higher value, and a person would be willing to just do the whole tanning process on this little piece of hide if they had no choice. And then the Gemara asked about planting. We find that how much seeds or how many seeds are considered valuable. And we said, well, to carry on Shabbos, you're not going to just carry around one seed. If you carry a few seeds, depending on the size, maybe 5, maybe that makes a just under a dried fig dimension. And yet we find that once the seed plants and sprouts, you're not even allowed to care for one seed, seeming to indicate that there's a difference between an unprocessed and processed item. And of course, the Gemara then answered that the way a seed, leather that's not tanned, there's usually like 100% success rate that if you take leather and you put it through the process, it'll turn into, or you take hide and put it through the process, it'll turn into leather. However, with seeds, it's not exactly such a high success rate. Out of a certain amount of seeds, some will sprout and some will not. And therefore, a person's going to hedge their bets when it comes to seeds. But with leather, there's no such difference. The Gemara is now going to ask 2 more questions, 2 more subjects that seem to indicate a difference between stages in the process when it's ready or when we start out. And that's what our Gemara is going to explore. So before we start, I just want to mention we have a few dedications. So we're learning the Zechus, the speedy recovery for Leah Basrita, as well as for a speedy recovery for Harav Shimon Halevi ben Leah. It's the father of a friend of mine who is dealing with some medical things, so we'll daven that he should have a speedy recovery. Additionally, we are dedicating and learning the Ilay Nishmas Daniel Yerachmiel ben Gedalia, and Leiloi Nishmas Arya Yaakov ben Litvin. I should say that I yesterday visited Gedalia Fenster. Maybe you know who Gedalia is. Gedalia is a chashav yid in South Florida, very involved in Chesed and teaching Torah. And so I was by the Shiva, and I let him know that we were mentioning his son's name in connection to our learning. Oh, I should add, Gedalia is also a supporter of the shul, although he hasn't lived here for a very long time. He continues to be a supporter of the shul, and so it's appropriate that we should honor his son's neshama with our learning. And now let us share the screen and begin our study. Again, to remind everyone, if you're muted, please be welcome and consider unmuting yourself the moment you have a question or comment so that we can hear and learn from you. Here is the Gemara. Now I need you to help me out over here. Did we talk about mud yesterday or cement? No. Okay, so the Gemara is not going to go back and say, hold on. Is there not a difference between this where you are in a process to how valuable or how little of an item is considered chashuv that you'd want to carry? Wouldn't you want to also differentiate between leather that's processed already and you're cutting off a little scrap to produce a wallet versus a piece of hide that you need to engage in the process? Surely it shouldn't be the same measure, the same dimension. So the Gemara says, let's take a look at tit. We usually translate tit as mud. Here, Rabbi Steinsaltz says it's clay, meaning it's earthy stuff that's going to be formed into something of use, some kind of vessel. Before he activates it with water. Tanya. So then we have a brisa that says, we already discussed earlier on, and when it comes to dirty, not potable water, water that you can't drink, you still can't carry it when it's the size of a revius, a quarter of a log, an egg and a half or so. So that much water is the amount of water that you would use to activate a little bit of cement or clay to do some work with. That is the dimension. A revius. We questioned this follow. What use is this water? And the Gemara says, this water is good for activating this clay, mud, or cement. But once the cement, once the clay has been activated, it's good. You have soft clay that you can work with. Tanya, there's another brisa that says, even a small amount of this clay, just to fill in a hole or a little opening in a vessel, which is a whole lot smaller than the amount of cement that's activated by a revius of water. So how much cement is chashuv? How much cement is valuable? Is it the amount of cement that's activated by a revius of water, or is it just a little dot? And the Gemara explains, we learned this already. They gave so seemingly we see that depending where you are in the process, if it's processed, unprocessed, there should be different amounts that are considered chashuv, different amounts that are considered worthwhile to schlep around. And the Gemara answers, well, there's something very different about tit, about this mud, this clay, versus leather. A person is not going to bother themselves to prep to activate the slightest dot of clay. It's just not how it works. So therefore, what's the smallest amount of clay the person is going to start working with? Well, whatever the amount of clay is that's activated by a revius of water. However, once you have it already prepared, you'll certainly use it to seal up or to make the opening or to treat the opening of a vessel. Or actually, the way Rabbi Steinsaltz explains it, which actually makes more sense, is it's used to coat the place where I guess they used to have a furnace that you'd have to put in oxygen or air, and so they would attach a piece and then they would seal the edge with a little bit of clay. So if you have the clay, you'll use it, but you're not going to bother to make the clay. So because clay, I guess, is of lower value, maybe it's less essential. So you're not going to schlep to make a little dot of clay, but you will to make that dimensional clay. So therefore, clay has different measures depending on how valuable and what you're willing to engage in. Leather, apparently it's acceptable to even process a small little strip of leather that's able to make a kamea. So that, again, is the answer to a challenge. Now, you might ask a question that I'm wondering, which is, why do we keep on asking all these different questions? It's clear that leather you treat the same, and we're going to bring different instances where maybe there's a different dimensions or measures depending on where you are in the process. And over there, you don't treat it all the same. So I'm sure many of the Achronim discussed that, but I suppose if we were to go back and revisit each of these instances, we'll see how they cover different areas of this idea, and they help us have a greater perspective on exactly how and why leather is treated different, or things like leather are treated different than other things, that there's more variability in the item before and after it's a finished product. And but I don't think we're going to engage on that level of scholarship at this moment. But just to point out that, again, I haven't seen it this round of studying the Gemara, but I'm certain that the commentaries are going to want to weigh in and make those kind of points. All right, anyone had any comments? Or if not, please unmute yourself, and we're going to have one last round of questions, and it's going to introduce to us some more specifics about leather. Alan, please go ahead.
I just, I just think that all these measurements are a ballpark figure as to what it should be.
Okay.
Because nobody can walk around there, with an eggshell in their pockets to see if what they're taking measures up to an eggshell or a half an eggshell, or walk around with a fig in your pocket to see if what you're taking is the size of a fig, and so on and so on.
I'm going to ask you to consult with Professor Stern after the class to help figure this out. But it's a good question. So the professor's principle is that it is an approximation, but it's a pretty close approximation, because people had a sense of different sizes, and you can kind of eyeball, just like a person that cooks a lot in the kitchen is able to eyeball and measure and get it pretty well. As a matter of fact, the Yiddish mama who's been making chicken soup for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, they'll make your chicken soup more perfect and precise than you or I don't know about you, but me sitting with a cookbook and trying to measure each amount, because when it's something that's common, you get pretty good at approximating. So I believe the professor's shita is that although we could take an egg and give you a precise dimension, people had an idea, and that's what we're saying. The amount that you would eyeball as a craftsman and say is the amount of cement that you want, well, that's exactly the amount of cement that you should not be carrying around. So I believe that would be the professor's shita. I hope I got it right. Reb Beryl, you wanted to say something too?
No, for sure.
Is he right,
sure
Professor?
The Yiddish mamas could never pass down a recipe because
Exactly.
they sit around and stay watch.
Right.
An indication of a different approach to the measurements is that the Gemara says an egg, so many eggs, and we come to the supermarket and we have large eggs and jumbo eggs and whatnot. That is, we do have a tendency to separate things more accurately, or we think that it's more accurately, but at the Gemara time, they didn't need it, although I'm sure they had larger eggs and smaller eggs as we do.
Of course. And in those days, they didn't go to the supermarket and find their eggs sorted. Every day, the roosters would lay eggs, and there was a certain range probably of what the dimension of an egg is. By the way, that might be an explanation to why today, if you study the contemporary poskim and you want to try to figure out how much wine you need for Kiddush, or how big your hadassim have to be on Sukkot, you'll find that there's a little bit of a range of those dimensions between different poskim, the different halachic opinions. And you wonder why. And the answer is because there probably was always a certain variability. And the question becomes then, okay, so are we machmer? And so famously, you'll look in the store, especially around the Sukkot time, and you'll see you have hadassim that have the size of the Chazon Ish's measurements, and you'll see someone else that has this posek. And I guess perhaps the professor at least would say, again, this is not to diminish or belittle the significance of getting the mitzvah right in a world where we can't eyeball an egg, but it's possible and plausible that in those days, the eyeballing was not as perplexing as it is to us Today we bought, but let's say, Alan, in the pharmacy, you give medicine and you have to do 5 mLs or whatever you put it. That's like precision. We have a syringe with the exact measurement. So today we are accustomed to precision, or at least as the professor says, an attempt, or we convince ourselves that we have precision. And so therefore, halachically as well, we can't say eyeball it because we're not used to eyeballing. So then the poskim give us the exact appropriate dimensions to fulfill the mitzvah. So I believe, I hope that at least helps deal with your question, which was a good one, and something that we've been grappling with throughout this Gemara, again, because we're not so accustomed to this way of seeing things.
It's a good thing there's one Gemara, not a bunch of them, or one Chumash, not a bunch of them, not a bunch of variations.
Well, what I'm going to show you soon is interesting, is that there is one Gemara, but there were sometimes some variations in the between the manuscripts, and sometimes those variations made big halachic differences. And Bli Neder, in the next Gemara after this, I'll show you an instance where the Rambam must have had a different version of the Gemara, and it changes some of the way he paskins in a very, very significant issue. So, but let's see the Gemara. Shkoyach Alan for the question. Tashema. Let's see if we can put this whole thing to rest. Let's see if we can figure out, is it true that leather is always considered the same? Is there always one dimension for leather, or are there different dimensions? And we're going to have a compelling case that maybe we do distinguish and differentiate between different stages of the process. Tashema, the following was conveyed to us by Rav Chia bar Ami in the name of Ula. You should know there are 3 different types of hides. And Rabbi Steinsaltz explains nicely, there are 3 stages in the process of hides. And they're referred to by different names depending on how processed they are. And this is very interesting. Matzah. The first of the hides is called matzah. Anyone know a word matzah? So matzah is actually related to the word matzah, as we'll see.
The matzah we have Pesach.
Oh, yes. Now, you certainly shouldn't go about eating leather.
Yeah, but it probably has the same, I guess it probably has the roughness like matzah.
Sometimes it tastes like leather.
Listen, sometimes, that's why you have to get the right matzah. If you get matzah that's 5 years old, I don't know if it tastes like leather, but it certainly is not going to be. And then there's a reason why people spend $50 for a box of Shatzer matzah or Montreal matzah, which is very popular. All right, let's see. So you have matzah, you have chipa or chifa, and difter. What are they? So the Gemara is going to continue quoting Ula. Matzah, kimashma. Matzah, it's like it sounds like. The hide has approximately the ingredients of matzah. Udala maliach, udala kemiach, udala afitz. It does not have salt. Let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz's translations. It does not have flour on it, and it was not treated with gallnuts. These are different ingredients that were known and used in those days to process hide. So matzah, by definition, is the most bland of doughs. It's just flour and water. No salt, no other stuff, no flavoring. Rashi, kamiach. So Rashi says, what does it mean, kamiach? They used to take the hide and they treat it with different chemicals. And I guess each combination would have a different chemical effect and break down the leather or process it. And so one of the steps apparently was they would soak the hide or cover the hide in flour and water. And I guess that drew out something from it, whatever it is. And then afitz, which we translated as gallnuts. It would be prepared and treated with these chemicals, which would help further break down the hide. In those days, they used gallnuts. Rashi says today they use cedar bark, which apparently had such a chemical effect. And so that's what matzah is. Not matzah, but about as processed, about as complicated as matzah. Then you have chifa. I'm sorry, no. Kama shiurai. How much matzah hide? How much of this not really processed hide are you not allowed to carry on Shabbos? Taught it Rab Shmuel bar Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yehuda taught, Kidei lotzar by mishkoilas ketana. the amount of leather that could, let's see this, wrap around a small weight. Why would they be wrapping around leather on a weight? I bet you if you lived in the time of the Mishnah, you wouldn't have this question. The reason why they used to cover their metal scales with leather was to protect the metal from breaking down. Imagine if you just have a metal and it was a softer lead metal thing, and you're constantly dropping all different kinds of stuff, it ends up scratching and breaking down. Because the softer metals can, or maybe even harder metals, softer metals can easily be scrapped. So they would put on like a pad of leather. And so that is the dimensions of this unprocessed leather hide that you cannot carry on Shabbos because it's useful. Don't ask any questions yet because the Gemara is still building up for making its case. Now, by the way, the Gemara says, Vikama, what is the size? How much leather is the kind of leather that you'd put as a pad on a scale? Again, when I say scale, I mean, I think we know this, but you know the way we describe a scale with two sides and you put the weight on one side. So that's what we're talking about. So how much is that? Riva de pumpadisa. A quarter litra, a quarter of a litra, which was a kind of weight that was used in pumpadisa. Rashi, roiva litra shel pumpadisa, derech hasoichrim. The way it was is that the shopkeepers, the merchants, later mishkela shel iferes, they would pad their lead scales. So Rashi actually says himself. They were made out of lead. By the way, today, in those days, they didn't know that probably it's not a good idea to have lead. There could have been some lead poisoning if you're measuring food with you. But anyways, in those days, that's how it was. So this is the dimension of the matzah skin, the untreated skin. The Gemara continues. Chifa, this second kind of hide. Dimoliach, it's salted, which we know that salt is an important step in processing anything, especially in the ancient world. It extracts the moisture and whatever else it does to it. Dimoliach v'la kamiach v'la afit. So he was salted, but it wasn't floured and it wasn't treated with the gallnuts. Rashi kami, no. V'kama shiurai, how much of this hide can you not carry? Kedetanan or kedelasis kameya, as we learned in the Mishnah, this that it's treated, you cannot carry even the size, the piece of leather, a size to make a kameya holder, a holder for an amulet, or as Rabbi Steinholz translates, to make the kameya itself. Diftera, the third type of hide, dimoliach, vikamiach. It's salted and floured. Sounds like a schnitzel or something. I don't know. Anyways, the maliach v'kamiach v'la afitz, but it hasn't been treated by the very strong chemicals. Kamashiri, kidei lichtoi v'olav esaget. It is the size of a parchment, a size of hide that you could write on it a get, a divorce document. Now, if anyone here has gone through a divorce or a Jewish divorce, or they've been a witness at a Jewish divorce, and it's a fairly common procedure. I mean, it's always sad, but sometimes necessary. So you know that if you've been through it, you know that it's a fairly complicated process. It can take a little while. There's a lot of talking and a lot of words and a lot of verifying and a lot of talking to the husband and to the wife and to the people that write the get are all constantly affirming that they're doing it lishma, right? They're doing it with the proper intention for the individuals who are going to receive it, etc., etc. You also know that it's not the shortest. It's not a contract to purchase a house, which today, of course, you can have 30, 40, 50 pages on such a contract.
It's a lot more than 2 oishes.
A lot more than 2 oishes, but how big is a get? So we'll learn Maseches Gittin. We'll learn that there's like a whole number of lines and whatever. But the essence of the get, says Rashi, is actually very short. The essence, like the active ingredients. The active ingredients in a get are, Rashi says, Gufay shall get. What is the essence of a get? The words that say, Harei at muteres l'chal adam. Behold, you are permissible to anyone. You're no longer bound to the husband in marriage. Ushma yushma, his name, her name, the Ha'edim, the signature of the witnesses, the Hazman, and the date. And ironically, and a little bit counterintuitively, Rashi says that this get, it's not a lot of words. What do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let's say 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 17, 18, 20 words possibly, 25 words. On a 12, on a 10 font size, we're talking about very little. I talk about font. Anyways, so that is the dimension of how much of the difta you're not allowed to carry.
Rabbi,
Yes, Rabbi.
unfortunately, I have the experience, but I got into trouble because I asked the Rabbanim, how could you say Hareyat Kolodom? She's not to a coin. So I had a 2-hour. We had a 2-hour session because of that.
Yeah, because the rabbis want to make sure you don't have any.
No, they were surprised because they only know the baseball hat or the black hat.
Listen, you have to be very careful when Rabbi walks into the office. You don't know what kind of chachma you're gonna get.
Did nobody ever ask that Shaila?
With Shaila,
Muteret lekol adam when she's not?
it means you're not bound. You're not tied to the individual. You're permissible to whoever you're permissible within your class. I don't mean a class is maybe the wrong word, but basically you're not.
Anyway, let's not go there.
Anyway, okay, fine.
This Shabbos Garet. Okay.
All right. So we have here a teaching of the 3 different kinds of hides that are in 3 stages in the process. And we have 3 different measurements of how big or how small the hide is to be valuable to you, and therefore you cannot carry it. And that's a problem. Why is that a problem for us? Because we keep on saying there's one single size, the size of the kameh holder. So Gemara says, Ketani Miyas, take a look. What do we say? We said that the hide that's the size to coat, to pad a scale. And that's a larger dimension than the amount of leather needed for a kameya. And if that's the case, it's not always the same dimension. And so what do we do with our teachings that we keep? What do we do with Rav Nachman's assertion that it's one measure? And we have the measure, and it's a quarter of a Pumpadisian liter, which is apparently more than the kameya. So the Gemara answers, this is an exception. This is an exception because the leather we're talking about that is to be made into a pad is actually not useful and not usable for other stuff. Let's read the Gemara and then we'll see Rashi. Hasan bibi shula. Here we're talking about a hide that is bishula. Let's see how Rabbi Steindl translates it first. Talking about wet hide, moist hide. Rashi, lach, kimoishu hufshach. The hide, the way it was just skinned. It's just off the animal. Kari bishula, lushin bishul, shulach. It's called like it's cooked in water because it's moist. And you really can't do much of the tanning process when the hide are still fresh. And therefore, it's not useful for many things. Therefore, if you're going to start processing it while it's still moist, Rashi says it's really only going to be good for a pad, but not to turn into something that's a little more complex. Once it dries out, now you can start hot tanning it. And now that it's ready to go through the tanning process, even if it's untanned, it still has the same measurements. So again, we had a very big question. The big question is, how could Rav Nachman say that all hides are created equal? All hides are a problem to carry with a single dimension, where we have a text here, a teaching here, which clearly shows us that sometimes there are other dimensions. And the Gemara's answer here, which it probably feels or sounds a little bit slightly like a doichik. It's a little bit of a hard answer, but the Gemara answer is very simple. When leather is still fresh, it's still straight off the animal. well, then it's not ready to go through the tanning process. Therefore, it's only useful for a larger measure. But as soon as it's dried out and all it needs now is to be processed, well, then we look at potential leather as leather. That's the Gemara's answer. And so in truth, Rav Nachman could have said, oh, most hide is like leather, but there's one exception. But instead, we spoke more in a generality. I suppose the people who are buying the leather from the farmer or from the butcher or whatever, or the shochet, they probably buy the hides in bulk, and by the time they're buying them, they're probably already dry. So processed hide, unprocessed hide, typically by the time it gets to the purchaser, it's already ready to be made into hide. But there is a scenario where it's fresh off the animal, and then you actually cannot process it. And so that is how we would explain this next challenge to Rav Nachman's assertion about all hide having the same size that you're not allowed to carry. Now, I don't want to go too far into this get thing, but not everybody agrees. Not everybody agrees that the get is a super small piece of paper. So actually, Tosfos says, and let's skip Tosfos, but suffice it to say one thing. Tosfos challenges Rashi by Rashi's assertion that the get is the smallest possible use of leather. Because in truth, if you turn leather into parchment, you can write the smallest parsha in a tefillin. And according to Tosfos, that might actually be smaller. Let's just see one more thing.
I wonder when suede was introduced into the market.
A few years after the Gemara was. Now, I want to see one thing. The Rambam here talks about leather. Let's see what the Rambam says about leather. Hamaitzi are, and by the way, this is not the Rambam that I was referring to that I'm going to show you, Blineder, how there's differences of how to read the Gemara. Hamaitzi are shalinis abed klal. If you carry totally unprocessed leather, eladain hurach, it's still soft. Shirei kedei lasur mishkalas kitana shemishkala shekel. Now, how big of this leather is a problem to carry? The amount that you'll put as a pad in a scale. Once it's ready and being prepared for the tanning process, well, then it's the dimension to make a kameah. Now, what if it's only started the process? Then it's not really ready to be made into a kameah. So here he quotes the Gemara and says that it's the size to write a get, but once it's finished. So I don't want to go into the whole Rambam and see why he paskin the way he does. He's basically quoting our Gemara. Suffice it to say that Rav Nachman was really talking about two types of leather: tanned leather and leather that's just waiting to be tanned. But suffice it to say, the Rambam quotes that there are actually many other possible states. And hold on, what did I just do? Sorry, 1 second. With me? All right, we'll move on. Let's see the next Gemara. Chalbert, is that you in there? Here's a chance to try out our. Let's see if this is better. No, it's not. All right, we're still trying to figure out the best settings to prevent that noise in the background. We're not there yet. All right, let's continue the Gemara. So that was one question, the question of leather. The Gemara is now going to continue with one last question. And it's also going to be about hide. It's also more specific about the dimensions of hide that one can't carry. And what we're going to find out over here is we're going to find a citation that says that there's a big difference between that when it comes to carrying leather on Shabbos, its dimensions are 5 hand breadths by 5. I believe it's 5 hand breadths or 5 hand breadths. And we're going to ask, that's strange because we just said that it's the size to make a kameh, which is much smaller than those hand breadths. And the Gemara will give the answer that we'll see, and then we'll be finished with this discussion about leather. So let's take a fast look. Batanan, another problem with Rav Nachman's assertion that all leather has to be the size, can't be carried when it's the size to make a kameya. Here is the Mishnah. It says like this: Habeged, a garment. How much garment is a problem for the laws of Tumah and Tahara? This is familiar. We read this before. When it's 3 by 3 handbreadths, it can become impure if certain kinds of impure people step on it. So if a Zav steps on a piece of material that's 3 tefachim by 3 tefachim, it becomes impure. What about hasak? What about this more coarse material, sack, which was made of goat's hair, which you must recall when we talked about clothing. What on Shabbos, right? Hasak. It was made out of more coarse goat's hair. Arba. Now it has to be 4 tefachim. Or what about leather? Leather has to be even larger. Chamisha. Only when it's 5 tefachim by 5 tefachim, that is the kind of leather that becomes ritually impure. Mapots. What about a mat? Shisha. Then it's 6 tefachim. Ben lemidras, ben lemes. And these impurities are both if it's stepped on by a zav or if it comes in contact with a corpse. The Tani Allah in our Gemara said, and we learned this before in our Gemara, habeged asak v'ha'ar, both the regular material and the sack, the goat hair material and the leather, kishi or l'tumah, their common dimension for impurity, kachshir loitza. I'm sorry, the amount, the dimensions that cause them to be ritually impure, that is the very dimension that one is prohibited from carrying out. So let's look back. Chamisha, leather that's 5 tefachim by 5 tefachim, which is certainly larger than the size of the amount of leather needed for a kameya. So now we need to go back to Rav Nachman and say, Rav Nachman, it's time to amend your comment that loishna, leather, hide, that's going to be leather, is a problem to carry even if it's the size of a kameya. And we should amend it to say, no, it has to be 5 tefachim by 5 tefachim. Let's see Rashi. Kach shir leitzah Shabbos alma she'ein me'ubed, leather that's not hide, that's not processed. Chamisha tefachim be'inon. It has to be the size of 5 tefachim. Masnisim mukim b'me'ubed. And you'd have to say that our Mishnah is talking only if it was processed, then it's like a kameya. But that would be unlike Rav Nachman's comment. So our answer is ahu bikur tuvla. This is talking about a unique kind of leather. What's unique about this kind of leather? Well, or hide, I should say. Well, I guess there's a kind of way that you could process hide that it no longer is capable. It is no longer capable of being tanned in the conventional manner. What is that? So sometimes, I guess if you were in a rush, you could put the leather in boiling water, and it becomes very hard, and it becomes good for so as we know, hide can be processed in different manners. Sometimes it's turned into parchment, and sometimes it's turned into shoes or belts or whatever. Sometimes you get turned into tefillin, and sometimes, especially in the ancient world, you just needed a thick mat. And apparently, if you put the leather in hot water without it going through the whole process, it becomes functional for those specific uses, but it becomes no longer able to be used for more refined, processed leather. So why here do we say that or hide to be prohibited to carry has to be 5 tefachim on 5 tefachim? Because here we're talking about a kind of hide that's only going to be used as a cover to your bar stool, or as a cover to some other coarse use. It's not the kind of leather that you're going to buy in the market in Venice or in whatever, or maybe in Rome where they're going to sell tourists little tchotchkes. Well, that's not good for that. This is more good as a mat, as a soft, hard cushion or whatever to that effect. Usually leather that's just available to be processed, Rav Nachman would still assert that it needs to be, or even if it's just as big as the amount of leather to make a kameya, that's already a problem. And I believe now we're turning the page from Ayin Tes Amud Aleph to Ayin Tes Amud Beis, and we now B'Shal Tov Matzlachas have concluded this discussion about pushing back against Rav Nachman. Reb Beryl, please go ahead.
Rabbi, I'm trying to figure out this whole discussion, the whole area that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason we're there is what kind of korban to bring. But
No,
in practical terms today, what are we to learn from this? That I should feel better if I notice I carried only a little amount in my pocket on Shabbos?
no. What you should learn from this is that you're a Yid, and Torah talks about a lot of different subjects, some that are immediately applicable every day, and some of them that are only on occasion, and some of them not at all, but it's still part of our Jewish tradition. And more specifically, there are occasions, and I don't want to go down that road now. There are times where there might be, because of unique circumstances, there may be a waiver to do something in a way that's only a derabanan, for example. And so the dimensions that we're saying you cannot carry, that would be biblically prohibited, and it would be much more severe. But there might be certain situations, possibly, where a small dimension may be less problematic. But the main thing is, yes, teshuvah. We need to do teshuvah. We need to know when we by mistake carried the leather away from the factory. Do we need to do teshuvah for a biblical prohibition or for a rabbinic prohibition? So this is an essential part of Jewish scholarship and knowing about Shabbos.
But
To understand that the primary prohibition of Shabbos is to carry something in its smallest dimensions that make it useful.
But
And
it's so subjective, because even useful.
If it was subjective, no, it would be subjective if not for the fact that the Gemara is giving us some specific.
But I'm thinking of whether the amount is useful. Think of somebody who's working in miniature for whatever. So a tiny scrap, might be something, I don't know, he's making tchotchkes or whatever. Whereas to the average person, he wouldn't even notice it. He would throw it out.
So, Beryl, that's such a good question. And that's exactly what our Gemara discussed several pages ago, which is there a standard? And when can it be a problem to carry something below the standard? And that was the whole matzniya. If you are a professional miniature guy, and so therefore you have in your workshop a bunch of little scraps, well, because you matzniya, because you store it, it's possible. There's different opinions exactly how so, but that might be the very reason why it's considered carrying for you and not considered carrying for someone else.
Right, perfect, yeah.
So what you're asking is good, but the Gemara actually, it's such a good question. The second half of your point, the Gemara itself considered. Now, as to your question about the value or the reason, listen, the Gemara wants to know everything. The Gemara wants to figure everything out. So the Gemara doesn't say, it's a small detail. Let's leave it. Let's leave it off the table. The Gemara wants to go through everything. So this is the Gemara teaching us how to address a subject and how to synthesize between different Mishnahs and different texts. And so being that this is a halacha, and Rav Nachman made a statement, the Gemara is going to introduce all these different other Mishnahs or all these other opinions to try to see if they can work with Rav Nachman. Now, by the way, just as scholars, we don't just now have a clearer perspective of Rav Nachman. We've also been introduced to 5 or 6 different other subjects on different matters of carrying on Shabbos. And so we're enriched in both directions. It's not just that we have an answer to a question, but the question itself introduced us new ideas in the laws of Shabbos. And so that's how I understand it. But it's a good question, and it's good to keep on. It's always good for us to keep on asking these kind of questions. How is it applicable? Is it applicable? What's the practical? And why does the Gemara care so much? So Yasher Koyach. Alan, you're muted. We can't hear you.
It also gives us such a perfect indication as to how these people lived.
Yes.
And how they measured things and how they got around to doing things like that.
That is,
it's mind-boggling.
Absolutely. So I wouldn't say that that's the primary objective, but it's certainly a very big window into what life was like. And
I wonder 200 or 300 years from now, if people are going to read the Gemara again and say, "Wow, what a difference!"
Well, I hope so. I'm sure they will.
We
I don't know.
I don't know. Back to square one.
Or a barrel. I was going to say, I don't know if in 300 years from now they're going to be learning the Gemara on Safari on the internet on Zoom. I don't know. Maybe they'll be. Well, anyways, okay. Far be it for me to try to speculate how they might be learning Gemara.
They'll poskin that these rules only apply on Earth, not on the
Oh,
other
exactly. And say, on Mars, how does this apply to life on Mars?
How do you carry when there's no gravity?
Yeah, how do you build an Eruv in a space? Can you build an Eruv on the International Space Station? Is it considered a Rishus HaYachid? What if they'll make an International Space Station that has 600,000 people? So I'll have a big shilas. All right, let's see. Kalaf. Let's just start the next Gemara because I'm promising for 2 days that we'll be here. Kalaf. So our Mishnah finished talking about leather and hide, and it goes on to talk about parchment. To us, parchment is a simple item. Simple. You go to the store, you go to the Judaica, you go to the Sofer, and they have sheets of cloth, and they write tefillin and mezuzahs and Torahs, and that's about the extent of it. But in truth, it's not so simple because there are different types of cloth. And not just like we think, there's different thicknesses. So for example, we wrote the Torah for my mother. So the Sofer convinced us that we should really try the new thing. They have very light cloth. And I was convinced that that's a good idea because the other Sefer Torah that the shul has are very heavy, quite heavy. And so it's good to have a lighter Torah. That's a standard size, but it's and so it's super thin. If you ever had an aliyah, if you've ever lifted the Torah for Hagbar or seen it, you'll notice it's so thin that it also could be a little bit more prone to wrinkling or bending because it's so thin. But that's not what we're talking about here. Once upon a time, the process of making parchment was a little more complicated. So let's see. Klaf kedei lichtev ala parsha ktana. How big is klaf that you can't carry? Today a lot of times you have the sofer will come to a shul and do a program, and he'll show his quill, and he'll show you some parchment, and he'll show you how to fill in, and then he'll write for you. If he'll give you a little piece of parchment, and I'll write your name. Have you ever seen that? So how much parchment is chashuv enough that you can't carry it? So the Mishnah says to write a small parsha. But we're now going to ask a challenge based on a teaching about the materials of based on another text. Klaf viduch sustus. Elsewhere it says that you're not allowed to carry klaf or duch sustus. If you could write on it a mezuzah. What's the problem? Well, a parsha kitana, we said, is Shema, right? It's the smallest segment. It's the smallest parsha in the Tefillin. Tefillin have 4 different parshas, and in the Shel Rosh, each one goes into a separate box. That's why if you look at the Tefillin Shel Rosh, you look at your head Tefillin, and it looks like one big square. And then you notice there's lines going down the Tefillin. And many people that I speak to imagine or assume that those lines are some kind of design. But in truth, those lines are not a design at all. Those lines actually represent a very, very microscopic small cut that goes all the way inside down in the tefillin. And the head tefillin is actually 4 little rectangular boxes. And each of the 4 rectangular boxes, which to us look like a square, each one has their own little piece of parchment with 4 different parshias, 4 different segments that belong in the tefillin that are from the Torah. What's the smallest of those 4? Shema. What's a mezuzah? A mezuzah doesn't just say Shema. A mezuzah has in it the parsha of Shema and the Hoya im Shemoya. And so mezuzah is going to be larger than parsha Ketana. So how does our Mishnah say, or it's a contradiction? Is it a parsha Ketana? Is it the Shema, or is it Shema and Hoya im Shemoya? So the Gemara here gives an interesting answer. My mezuzah. What does it mean when it says Lichtay ba'alav mezuzah? Excuse me. Mezuzah shevet tefillin. It means the scroll that's like a mezuzah that's in your tefillin, meaning Shema. Apparently, maybe, sometimes, one might call a scroll of the tefillin also a mezuzah. So the Gemara says, hold on 1 second. I've never in my life called a scroll of tefillin a mezuzah. The kari lehula tefillin mezuzah. Is it normal? Is it something to call a scroll of a tefillin mezuzah? Let's read Rashi. Shabbat tefillin. The hasam dalid igros. Excuse me. The dalid parshis. There are 4 scrolls that each have on them 4 parshis. The shir bechad minayud. I know shma ketana shma. The dimension is the smallest of them. The Gemara says in. Yes, it is true. Sometimes you'll call the scroll of the tefillin a mezuzah. But Tanya, all right, let's read a little more. Just a few minutes left.
There was only one kind of tefillin in the time of the Gemara. We obviously don't have Rabbeinu Tam tefillin.
I wouldn't necessarily say that, believe it or not. Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi didn't exist. But let's hold on for a second. B'hatanya. We're going to see a brisa where a scroll of the tefillin is called a mezuzah. It says in a brisa, "Ritzua is tefillin im hatefillin." The straps of the tefillin with the tefillin. B'tamis es hayadayim. They could cause a person's hands to become impure. Tefillin make your hand impure? Well, maybe you remember we discussed this, and Rashi reminds us, le'inyan truma. You would have to wash your hands again in order to eat truma. Why did the rabbis make a gezerah that you should wash your hands after holding tefillin? If you recall, there was a desire to keep very separate food, stuff from tefillin and scrolls, because if you put food next to your holy articles, the mice that eat your food might, God forbid, also vandalize and damage your tefillin. But the tefillin bifnei atzmon, if they don't have their straps with them, ein metamis esayadayim, then they will not make your hands impure. Right? Is that what excuse me? No, Rabbi Steindal says different, and I'll take his word. He says, when the straps are not attached to the tefillin, they don't make your hands impure. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Mishum Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon, son of Yehuda, quotes Rabbi Shimon saying, if you touch the strap of the tefillin tar, your hands are pure. You don't need to wash your hands again in order to eat truma. Until you touch the actual part of the tefillin that holds the scrolls. Rabbi Zakkai Mishmai Omer. Rabbi Zakkai quotes, however, Rabbi Shimon to say, Tahar Achayiga b'mezuzah atzma. One's hands are ritually pure. I shouldn't say ritually pure. One's hands are not problematic to handle teruma. Achayagia b'mezuzah atzma, until he actually touches the scrolls of the tefillin. Before asking the question that you're wondering, which is how does somebody handle their tefillin and end up touching the mezuzah, which is a good question. Let's just notice that here we have a brisa where the scroll of the tefillin is referred to as a mezuzah, establishing that it is not unheard of to reference the scroll, the igeris of the tefillin, by calling it a mezuzah. Rashi, mezuzah, heina igrois shehem b'soich habatim. Those are the actual scrolls that are inside of the tefillin. Suffice it to say, today, and not just today, but of late, it's not plausible. It's not likely that you're going to be able to actually touch the parshias that are in your tefillin, because it's well sealed and closed up. So I don't have the exact answer, but maybe the tefillin then were a little more loose, or maybe it was easier to touch the scrolls. I don't know, but that's what the text says, and it proves for the purpose of our Gemara, which is that we can call the scrolls of the tefillin a mezuzah. Tomorrow we're going to continue, and we're going to talk a little more about what's in the tefillin, and then we're going to talk about how, and I'll just tell you the Cliff Notes version. A hide that is turned into parchment can be split in half. Both sides, once upon a time, would be processed into parchment, and once upon a time, different types of parchments would be used for different types of products. including tefillin mezuzahs. And so we're going to go a little bit more into a deep dive about the nature of the different kinds of parchments. We're also going to identify the different names for parchments. We're going to see Rashi presents the common understanding of the definition. And then I'm going to show you Blina de the Rambam, who has a very different understanding of those very same ideas. And we actually have correspondences between the Rambam and community of Chachamim, I believe it was in Italy. I have to double check. And we actually have a correspondence where he discusses these very terms, and it's very interesting. So let us do so. I wish everyone a wonderful day. Ashakat for joining, and let's hear only good news for health and healing, and goodness for all of Klal Yisrael. And I want to thank all those that joined us. I want to thank those that joined us till the end. Those that joined us for the first time, have a blessed day, and look forward to studying tomorrow. Be'ezer Hashem.
Shalom Bear.
Shalom Bear. Chumash. All right. As soon as we end the link, please rejoin to study Chumash.